Get your things out by Friday. I don't care where you go. People like you were never supposed to be in this building anyway." He said it standing in the doorway, one hand on the frame, the other holding a piece of paper he hadn't bothered to fold. The paper was an eviction notice. He had filled it out by hand. The ink was still slightly smeared on the word nuisance. The woman standing across from him didn't step back. She didn't raise her voice. She stood in her own doorway in a yellow housecoat with her hands folded in front of her. The way someone stands when they have learned, over a long life, that stillness is not the same as surrender. She looked at him the way you look at weather, not afraid of it, not trying to argue with it, simply noting that it was here. Behind her, in the apartment, 2 children had gone absolutely quiet. The neighbors on the floor, 3 doors down, a young couple who had heard every word through walls that were not thick, did not come out. The hallway was empty and fluorescent and smelled like floor cleaner and old carpet, and nobody moved. He didn't know her name, not her full name. He had called her the woman in 4C in his texts to the building manager, and that family in the complaint he had filed with himself, since he was also the landlord, and the complaint was therefore a document he had written and received and approved in the same afternoon. He had no idea who she really was, not who she had been, not who was coming to that door in 72 hours, not what the small wooden box sitting on the kitchen table behind her contained, or what the name carved into its lid meant to people whose names appeared in certain buildings in this city. Buildings with marble floors and security desks and flags out front. He had just made the kind of mistake that looks, in the moment, like power. Have you ever been told you don't belong somewhere? Not because of anything you did, but simply because of who you are? Have you ever stood in the doorway of your own home and been handed a reason that wasn't a reason at all? Let me take you back, not to Friday, to the beginning, to a woman named Dorothy Mae Calloway and the apartment she had kept for 11 years, and the life she had built inside it that no piece of smeared handwriting was going to undo. Dorothy Calloway was 67 years old and had lived in apartment 4C at the Linmore building on Garfield Street for 11 years, which was longer than the current landlord had owned the building. She had moved in under a previous owner, a quiet man named Mr. Yoon, who had fixed things when they broke and returned calls when they were made, and she had signed her lease and paid her rent, $987 a month, then $1,020, then $1,055, the small annual increases that were simply the cost of staying. And she had never been late, not once, not in 11 years. She had a 2-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor. The 2nd bedroom belonged, until 3 years ago, to her husband Curtis, who had died of a cardiac event on a Wednesday morning in February, while Dorothy was at the grocery store and had been gone by the time she came back, with the bag still in her hands. The 2nd bedroom belonged, since then, to her granddaughter Imani, who was 9 years old and who had come to live with Dorothy when Imani's mother, Dorothy's daughter, Renee, had gone through a year that required the kind of help that grandmothers provide by simply being present and reliable and unchanging, which Dorothy was. Imani was 9. She practiced the piano. Not on a real piano. There was no room and no budget for a real piano in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor. She practiced on a 61-key digital keyboard that sat on a folding table in the 2nd bedroom, plugged into a small amplifier that Dorothy had bought second-hand for $32, and she practiced with the diligence that 9-year-olds bring to things they love without yet understanding why they love them. She practiced scales in the morning before school. She practiced the pieces her teacher gave her in the evenings. On Saturdays, she practiced both. The amplifier was not loud. Dorothy had measured it, in the way that people measure things when they are trying to be fair to a situation that is not being fair to them. She had downloaded a decibel meter application on her phone and held it next to the amplifier during Imani's practice sessions. The readings ranged from 41 to 54 decibels. Normal conversation is 60. A refrigerator hum is 40. She had written this down. She had saved the screenshots. She kept them in a folder on her phone and in printed copies in a manila envelope in the kitchen drawer next to the takeout menus. She kept them because Curtis, before he died, had been a man who believed in documentation the way some people believe in prayer, not instead of action, but alongside it, as its form of preparation. The wooden box on the kitchen table had been Curtis's, walnut, about the size of a shoebox with a fitted lid and a small brass clasp. His name was carved into the lid, Curtis Elijah Calloway. Below his name, also carved but smaller, were 5 letters. USSF Dorothy had never displayed the box prominently. It sat on the table because she had been going through Curtis's papers that afternoon. The same thing she did on the last Sunday of every month, the private maintenance of a life that had ended but whose paperwork had not. Inside the box were letters, photographs, certificates, a folded flag, and things too personal to inventory here. Enough to say, Curtis Calloway had not been simply a man who lived quietly on Garfield Street. He had been that and other things in the way that people who do extraordinary things are also, often, quietly, people who live simply. Dorothy had kept the box on the table because she had been interrupted in her sorting by a knock on the door that had turned out to be the landlord. The landlord's name was Brian Metcalf. He was 53 years old and had purchased the Linmore building 4 years ago as an investment property, which is to say he had purchased it with the intention of making it generate more than it cost, which is the sentence that precedes many of the stories that get told about buildings like this. He lived in a house in Fairview, 20 minutes away, and he came to the Linmore building infrequently, and when he did, he came with the specific energy of a man whose sense of ownership had not been softened by any particular sense of responsibility. He had received over the past 4 years 7 maintenance requests from apartment 4C, a slow drain in the kitchen, a window lock that didn't seat properly, a crack in the bathroom ceiling that had grown, over 18 months, from a hairline to something you could slide a finger into, the radiator in January that had stopped working for 11 days during the coldest stretch of the winter. Dorothy had documented each request in writing by text message and had kept a folder. 3 of the 7 had been addressed eventually. 4 remained open. He had also received, in the past 6 months, 3 complaint letters written by himself, addressed to himself, regarding the excessive noise and disturbance from apartment 4C. Each letter cited a specific date and time. Dorothy had checked her calendar and her phone records for each date. On the first date, she and Imani had been at Renee's house for dinner. On the second date, Imani's keyboard had been in for repair and had not been returned yet. On the third date was a Saturday afternoon when Imani had practiced for 45 minutes, which the decibel screenshots confirmed had peaked at 52 decibels. He had kept copies of his own complaint letters. He had presented them to himself as documentation. He had filed the eviction notice on the basis of this documentation, which he had created, reviewed, and approved as the sole relevant authority in the situation, because the situation had been designed, from the beginning, to have only one authority in it. The eviction notice gave Dorothy 60 days. He had said Friday standing in the door, because 60 days was the legal requirement, and Friday was a way of saying it that felt more powerful than a number. He had one other thing working in his favor, or so he believed. The building's newest tenant, a man on the second floor named Mr. Pressler, who had moved in 7 months ago and who had in that time become the landlord's primary source of in-building grievancer. Pressler had called Brian Metcalf 4 times about the noise from 4C. Brian had taken these calls as validation. He had not asked Mr. Pressler what, specifically, he had heard. He had not asked what time the noise occurred or what it sounded like. He had simply received the calls as the social confirmation that his private grievance required before it could become official action. Mr. Pressler, for what it is worth, had also complained to Brian Metcalf about the couple on the 3rd floor, specifically about the smell of their cooking, which he had described in a text message as not appropriate for a residential building. Brian Metcalf had not filed any documentation on that complaint. He had responded with a thumbs-up emoji and moved on. The couple on the 3rd floor was not who he was building a file on. Dorothy read the eviction notice standing in her doorway, the same place she had received it. She read it slowly, the way you read something you are going to need to remember. Then she folded it in thirds, the way Curtis had taught her. Always fold a document like it might be evidence someday. And she went to the kitchen drawer and put it in the manila envelope with the decibel screenshots. Then she sat down at the kitchen table, next to the walnut box with Curtis's name on it, and she made 3 phone calls. The first call was to her daughter, Renee. The second call was to a tenant rights organization she had bookmarked on her phone 11 months ago, after the radiator, when she had had the feeling, the specific, familiar, long-experienced feeling, that she was being positioned rather than managed. The third call was to a woman named Patricia Osi-Mensah, who had been Dorothy's closest friend for 34 years and who happened to work as an administrative aide in the state legislature and who answered on the second ring, and to whom Dorothy told the whole story, beginning to end, in a voice that was steady and precise and entirely dry-eyed, because Dorothy Calloway did not spend tears on men like Brian Metcalf. Patricia listened to all of it. Then she said, "Dorothy, let me make one call." Dorothy said, "Patricia, I'm not asking for." Patricia said, "I know you're not asking, I'm offering. Let me make the call." There was a pause. The pause of a woman who has spent 67 years solving her own problems and who is deciding, in real time, whether to let someone help her. Then Dorothy said, "All right." She didn't know, in that moment, what the call would set in motion. She didn't know what Patricia knew. She didn't know that the person Patricia was about to call was, at that precise moment, in a car on the way back from a constituent event on the other side of the district, 40 minutes from Garfield Street. She didn't know that the person Patricia was calling had known Curtis Calloway, had known him for 20 years, had spoken at his funeral, had kept, framed on the wall of an office in the state capitol building, a photograph taken at a ceremony 15 years ago in which Curtis stood straight and formal in his dress uniform, and the person standing next to him had their hand on his shoulder, and both of them were smiling the way people smile when a thing that was supposed to happen has finally happened. What happened in the 72 hours between the eviction notice and the knock on the door is the part of this story that moves in 2 directions at once. In one direction, Brian Metcalf continued to move with the confidence of someone who believes the paperwork is settled. He texted the building manager about scheduling a unit walkthrough for the following week. He sent a message to a property listing service. He told his wife, at dinner on Tuesday, that the unit situation at Linmore was finally getting cleaned up, and she had nodded and passed the bread. In the other direction, things were accumulating that he could not see. The tenant rights organization had assigned Dorothy a housing attorney named James Wolfe, who reviewed the eviction filing and the documentation within 4 hours of receiving it and called Dorothy back with a specific kind of calm in his voice that attorneys develop when they have looked at something and understood that the other side has made a significant error. He said, "Mrs. Calloway, I want to walk you through what I'm seeing here." He walked her through it. The complaint letters with dates that didn't match occupancy, the maintenance record, the 4 unaddressed repair requests, including the radiator, which under the city's implied warranty of habitability constituted a material breach of the lease that, legally, ran in precisely the opposite direction from the one the eviction notice had intended. He told her the eviction filing was, in his professional assessment, not only retaliatory, but potentially fraudulent. He said the word fraudulent carefully and clearly, the way you say it when you mean it. Dorothy said, "I know." He said, "I want to file a response and a counterclaim by Thursday morning." "Will you authorize that?" Dorothy said yes. Then she went to the kitchen drawer and got the manila envelope and read him every date and every decibel number from the screenshots. And he typed everything she said, because Dorothy Calloway had been keeping records for 33 years. Since the first time someone had handed her a piece of paper designed to make her feel like she had no options, and she had learned early and permanently that the paper was only as powerful as your preparation to answer it. Patricia Osi-Mensah made her call on Monday evening. The person she called was in the car, as mentioned, on the way back from the constituent event, and picked up on the third ring. That person's name was Senator Vivienne Adayeze Okafor-Mensah. She was 59 years old, in her 3rd term representing the 14th District, which included, among other neighborhoods, the stretch of Garfield Street where the Linmore building stood. She chaired the State Senate's Housing Committee. She had introduced, 2 sessions ago, the Tenant Protection and Anti-Retaliation Act, which was currently in its second year of implementation, and which had, in those 2 years, been cited in 47 housing cases in the state. She was also, it should be said, the person who had stood at the podium at Curtis Calloway's memorial service and said, into a church that was completely full, that Curtis had been the reason she understood what public service actually meant. Not the title, not the committee chair, not the name on the legislation, but the daily, faithful, uncelebrated work of showing up for people who needed someone to show up. She knew Dorothy. Not well, not the way you know someone you see every week. But she knew her the way you know someone who meant something to someone you loved. She had been to the apartment on Garfield Street once, for a dinner Curtis had hosted years ago. She remembered the yellow walls in the kitchen. She remembered Curtis's laugh. She listened to what Patricia told her. She asked 2 questions, then she said, "I'm going on Thursday." Patricia said, "Senator, you don't have to." The senator, Patricia, he evicted Dorothy Calloway. "I'm going on Thursday." She did not call ahead. She did not announce her visit to the building or to the landlord. She contacted James Wolfe, the housing attorney, and coordinated timing so that she arrived at the Linmore building 30 minutes after the counterclaim was filed with the housing court. A sequence that was not accidental. She also, on Wednesday, called 2 colleagues. One was the chair of the City Council's Housing Oversight Subcommittee. The other was the director of the state's Housing Enforcement Division, who had, as it happened, been looking for a test case to demonstrate the anti-retaliation provisions of the act that the senator herself had written. The director had told the senator 6 weeks ago that he needed a case with clean documentation. The senator had said she'd let him know if something came up. She was letting him know. Thursday morning, the Linmore building on Garfield Street 10:47 a.m. Brian Metcalf was in the lobby. He was there to meet the building manager about a maintenance schedule. The mundane business of a building that he managed from a distance and understood as an asset rather than a place where people lived. He was in a decent mood. The eviction filing was in. The attorney response from 4C had come in that morning and had surprised him, briefly, but he had texted his own attorney, who had said it was a standard defensive response. To sit tight, it would resolve. He was standing in the lobby with his phone in his hand when he heard the front door. He turned around. There were 4 people coming through the door. Not dramatically, not rushing, not loudly. 4 people walking in with the calm of people who know exactly where they are going and have no need to hurry. A woman in a dark coat who was speaking quietly to the person next to her. Behind them, a man in a suit carrying a briefcase. That was James Wolfe, though Metcalf didn't know that yet. And behind him, a younger woman with a notepad. It was the woman in the dark coat he was looking at. Something about her, the way she held herself, the specific economy of her movement, the way the lobby space seemed to reorganize slightly around her without her doing anything deliberate to cause it, made him stop in the middle of what he was doing. She looked up. She looked directly at him. She said, "Mr. Metcalf." Not a question, a confirmation. He said, "Yes?" She said, "I'm Senator Vivienne Okafor-Mensah. I represent this district. I'd like to speak with you about the eviction notice you served to apartment 4C. The lobby of the Linmore building was not a large space. It had a tile floor and a row of mailboxes and a window that faced the street. In that window, at that moment, the morning light was coming in at an angle that lit the senator's face from the left and put the landlord's face in. Partial shadow, and if you had been standing there, you might have noticed it. In that light, the precise moment when Brian Metcalf's expression underwent a change. It was not a dramatic change. His face didn't crumble. He was not a man who displayed things openly, but the color, the comfortable, morning errand. Nothing wrong here color of his face went from present to absent in approximately 3 seconds, and what replaced it was something that looked, to everyone in the lobby who was watching, like a man suddenly understanding the distance between where he thought he was standing and where he was. Actually standing, he said, "Senator." He seemed for a moment to be deciding how to follow the word. She let him decide. She waited with the patience of someone who has been in rooms like this before and understands that the silence is informational. He said, I I wasn't aware this had reached she said, Mr. Metcalf. The Tenant Protection and Anti-Retaliation Act, which took effect in this state 22 months ago, establishes specific prohibitions on retaliatory eviction. It also establishes specific obligations regarding habitability maintenance. I have, in my hand, a documented maintenance history for apartment 4C going back 4 years. I also have complaint documentation filed by the tenant, decibel readings, and calendar records establishing that 2 of the 3 noise complaints you filed are contradicted by timestamped evidence that the tenant was not in the building on the dates in question. She paused. This is also now in the hands of the State Housing Enforcement Division, which is the regulatory body charged with investigating violations of the Act. You'll be hearing from them formally, I expect by end of business today. The building manager, who had been standing 6 feet away with his clipboard, had stopped writing things on his clipboard. He was looking at the tile floor with the focused attention of a man who has decided to be extremely interested in a specific patch of floor. Brian Metcalf said, I think there may have been some miscommunication about James Wolfe. The housing attorney opened his briefcase and produced a document and set it on the mailbox ledge between them. He said, This is the counterclaim filed with the housing court at 10:16 this morning. It names retaliatory eviction, 4 counts of habitability violation, including the 11-day heating failure in January, and seeks damages under Section 14C of the Act, which provides for treble damages in cases of documented retaliation. I'm Mrs. Calloway's attorney. I thought you should have a copy. Brian Metcalf looked at the document. He looked at it the way you look at something you cannot pick up and cannot walk away from. His hand came up slightly and then went back down. He had the specific stillness of a man who has spent 4 days believing he was the only authority in a situation and has just discovered with considerable precision that he was not. The senator said, I'm going up to see Mrs. Calloway now. I suggest you speak with your attorney today. I further suggest that when you do, you discuss the withdrawal of the eviction notice as a first order of business. That will be relevant to how the Enforcement Division frames its inquiry. She didn't wait for an answer. She walked to the elevator that worked, the elevator in a building where the maintenance requests sat unanswered in a drawer, and pressed the button for the 4th floor. The lobby, after she left, was very quiet. What happened after that moved, as these things do, through several channels at once, each one faster than the one before it. The eviction notice against Dorothy Calloway was withdrawn in writing within 48 hours. Brian Metcalf's attorney advised it. The attorney did not use the word obvious, but the advice had the quality of something obvious. The State Housing Enforcement Division opened a formal investigation into the Linmore building. An inspector arrived on Monday morning and conducted a walkthrough of the building. The inspection report, filed 6 days later, cited 11 violations. 4 of them pertained directly to apartment 4C, the crack in the bathroom ceiling, now documented photographically, the window lock, a ventilation issue in the kitchen that had apparently existed for longer than the maintenance request suggested. The radiator, the 11-day January failure, was cited as a Class A habitability violation. The report also noted in a supplementary section that 3 complaint letters in the landlord's file cited dates on which, per records the tenant had provided, the supposed noise had not occurred. This section was forwarded to the city attorney's office, which was a different kind of forwarding. The damages process under the Tenant Protection Act was proceeding through housing court. James Wolfe was efficient and prepared, and the documentation Dorothy had kept in her manila envelope was, as he had said from the beginning, very clean. The treble damages provision meant the calculation moved in a direction that made Brian Metcalf's attorney use the word settlement in their second conversation and use it much more insistently in their third. The settlement was reached. The terms were not publicly disclosed, because settlements rarely are, but what was publicly disclosed? Because the Housing Enforcement Division's investigation and findings are public. Record was enough. The case became, within the housing advocacy community in the city, the kind of case that gets cited. James Wolfe cited it in the next 3 cases he filed. The anti-retaliation provisions of the Senator's Act had, in 47 prior instances, been invoked defensively. The Linmore building case was the first in which the Enforcement Division had pursued it proactively, with full regulatory weight from a standing start. The director of the Housing Enforcement Division said, in a public statement that was brief and specific, that the case demonstrated the act working exactly as intended. The senator said nothing publicly about her visit to the Linmore building. She had not gone for the statement. She had gone for Dorothy. But the younger woman with the notepad had been a housing reporter for the city paper, and the story ran on Friday. A careful, documented, specific story about a 67-year-old woman, a keyboard that never exceeded 54 decibels, and a landlord whose complaint letters described events on dates when the tenant wasn't home. The story mentioned the senator's visit. It mentioned Curtis Calloway, briefly, and the wooden box on the kitchen table, and the 5 letters carved beneath his name. It mentioned Imani, 9 years old, and her keyboard. The headline did not describe Imani's playing as a disturbance. It described it as what it was, a child practicing. The story was shared. The way stories get shared when they contain something people recognize, not as news, exactly, but as a thing they have felt, named and documented and held up to the light. Tenant rights organizations in 6 cities shared it. A housing policy account with a large following shared it with the caption, "This is what retaliation looks like, and this is what accountability looks like." The hashtag that emerged, not organized, not coordinated, just arrived, was "Let her play." The building manager of the Linmore building resigned 2 weeks after the inspection report. He cited, in his resignation letter, a desire to pursue other opportunities. He did not specify what those opportunities were. Brian Metcalf listed the Linmore building for sale in the spring. He listed it without fanfare, through a commercial real estate broker, at a price that reflected, in the broker's polite professional language, current market conditions and recent regulatory history. The building was purchased by a community land trust, a nonprofit housing organization that had been acquiring buildings in the neighborhood for 8 years with the specific intention of keeping them affordable for long-term tenants. One of the trust's first official acts after the purchase closed was to address the 4 open maintenance requests in apartment 4C. A plumber came for the drain. A contractor repaired the ceiling. The window lock was replaced. The radiator was inspected, serviced, and certified for the coming winter. The work was done in 2 days. Dorothy was given 24 hours advance notice for each visit, in writing, because that was the trust's policy, and because the trust understood that your home is where you deserve to be treated as though your convenience matters. Dorothy thanked each of the workers by name. She offered them coffee. One of them, the contractor who repaired the ceiling, came back the following week on a Saturday, off the clock, not asked, to repaint the bathroom where the crack had been, because he said the patch compound was a different shade and it bothered him. Dorothy told him it didn't need to be done. He said he knew that. He did it anyway. Imani turned 10 in the fall. Her mother Renee had stabilized in the way that people stabilize when they have the time and support to do so, and Renee was considering moving back to the east side, closer to Dorothy and Garfield Street. Imani had begun to speak, with the absolute certainty of 10-year-olds, about wanting to learn a second instrument, as Dorothy had begun, quietly, to price upright pianos. Secondhand, she had found one for $400, a Yamaha from 1987, on a listing site, and she had held her phone for a long time looking at the photograph. She had not yet told Imani. The senator came back to Garfield Street in the spring, not for any official reason. She came on a Saturday morning, in a regular coat, with no aide and no notepad, and knocked on the door of 4C. Dorothy opened the door and looked at her and said, without expression, "You want coffee?" It was not a question. The senator said, "Yes, please." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where the walnut box still sat, not put away, simply kept out, because it was Curtis's. And Curtis was still present in the apartment in every way that mattered. Dorothy had made the coffee in the percolator that had been a wedding gift which still worked perfectly, which Curtis had always said was because they had bought the right kind and taken care of it. The senator looked at the box for a moment and then looked at Dorothy and said, "He would have been so." He just would have, and stopped, because there was no sentence to finish that was sufficient. Dorothy said, "I know." She poured the coffee. He would also have had a lot to say about the condition of that bathroom ceiling. The senator laughed. It was the real kind. The kind that comes from somewhere specific and doesn't perform anything. They sat there for an hour. Imani came through once, briefly, on her way from the bedroom, and the senator said hello, and Imani said hello, back with the formal courtesy of a child who has been raised right, and then disappeared. From the second bedroom, a few minutes later, came the sound of scales, 41 to 54 decibels. Dorothy sat at her kitchen table with her coffee and listened to her granddaughter practice. And the morning light came through the east window the way it always had, and the walnut box sat in its place, and Curtis's name was on it. And below it the 5 letters that had stood for a life of faithful, unremarkable, permanent service. And below those letters, the sound of a child learning something beautiful in an apartment that was still, that had always been, and would continue to be, hers. If this story hit you somewhere real today, please take a moment. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe, hit the bell, and tell us in the comments. Have you ever held on to documentation that everyone around you thought was unnecessary? Have you ever built a file that somebody told you was paranoid, and then one day you needed it? Tell us. Here's what really gets me about Dorothy Calloway. It's not the senator. It's not the investigation. It's not even the settlement. Satisfying as every part of that is to watch unfold. What really gets me is the folder in the kitchen drawer. The manila envelope next to the takeout menus. 33 years of keeping records, not because anyone told her to, not because she was planning for a specific fight, but because Curtis had told her, early, that documentation is just another word for truth with a timestamp. She had learned it, and she had kept it, and she had passed it to her granddaughter. In the ordinary air of the apartment, the way you pass things that matter, not as a lesson, not as a warning, just as the way things are done. Brian Metcalf had all the visible power in that building. His name was on the lease. His signature was on the notice. He was standing in the lobby holding his phone like a man who has no reason to worry, and Dorothy had a folder. "I want to know something from you. Just one thing. Is there a person in your life, maybe gone now, maybe still here, who handed you one habit or one practice that you keep without even thinking about it anymore? The thing you just do, the way they taught you, without remembering that you were taught? Tell us about it in the comments. We want to know who gave you your folder.